After studying this
module, you shall be able to evaluate each different approach to this method, including the different styles of involvement of the researcher in the setting, the different ethics involved in the method, and the method of observation as a whole. You will be able to analyze the different types of observation, the fine details and the differences in relation to other techniques, and what kind of different data recording methods would suit the research question at hand. You would be able to study in detail the various data recording methods available in the field and how to use them appropriately such that they are relevant and apt to the context and the research question at hand. You will be able to know what groundwork is needed to be done before entering the field and exactly how the process of observational research is conducted and what has to be observed. The pillars of standardization, that is reliability and validity of the method of observation, will be known. The ethical guidelines which stand as the spine of every research endeavor will be known. You will be able to evaluate the advantages and disadvantages of the field of observational research such that the researcher is a critical consumer of knowledge and thus is aware of the pros and cons of his or her research. Let us look at observers' involvement in the setting. The participant and the non-participant observation. The degree to which an observer interacts with the individuals under the study is one of the most important considerations and determinants of the form of the study will take. The quality of the data that will be collected and the uses that can be legitimately made of the obtained results. Participant observation. Participant observation is an intense social interaction between observer and the participant in the milieu of the latter, during which time data in the form of field notes are unobtrusively and systematically collected. This system of research was highly criticized as it allows the researcher so much freedom in defining his or her appropriate realm of action and demands so little systematization of observations. However, this lack of agreed on rules or standard operating procedures is seen as its most remarkable feature of the particular approach. A vast number of studies have been carried out, including the studies of go-go dancers in the Philippines to midwifery in Algeria. Squads and squads define participant observation as a process in which the observer's presence in a social situation is maintained for the purpose of scientific investigation. The observer is a face-to-face relationship with the observed, and by participating with him in their natural life setting, he gathers data. He both modifies and is influenced by the context being observed. The advantages of participant observation are: it is more intensive participation and has the advantage of affording the observer a greater exposure to both the routine and the unusual activities of the group studied. The assumption is that the more intensive the participation, the richer the data. They are extremely useful in exploratory research and those in which hypotheses can be generated. This can be possible only in the undisguised manner, either completely or partially, which thus has lesser ethical impediments. What are the disadvantages of participant observation? They involve conscious, deliberate, non-original exhibition of behavior due to the undisguised nature of the research and presence of a researcher. The presence of the researcher might materially influence the group behavior in such a manner which leads to lower reliability of the observations. Due to experience of similar feelings, misinterpretation is possible. As we had studied one end of the continuum of the involvement of the observer, the various other levels may be explained as follows. Let us describe the 4 roles the observer takes in the continuum. The first role at the extreme of the continuum is that of a complete observer. Example, when the researcher is behind a one-way screen. The second role is that of an observer as a participant. The third stands to be participant as an observer. For example, the researcher is known and is overt and is an intimate friend of the participants. The final and the fourth, one extreme of the continuum, is the complete participant. Example, researcher who acts as a number and shares secret. This classification is similar to that of Gans, who collapses the middle 2 categories into one. Let us look at non-participant observation. Having discussed above the previous extreme of participant observation, non-participant observation can be explained as a situation wherein the researcher is not the part of the group he is studying and stays aloof from the group, as in being a complete observer or a peripheral member as explained above. The advantages of non-participant observation are: more objective form of observation is possible, leaving no scope for misinterpretation due to identification or attachment. It is more easier for both the researcher and the participants to be detached from one another. A low emotional bonding is seen. The observations are more reliable and valid due to the above features. The disadvantages of non-participant observation are: the slighter, subtle, in-depth intricacies cannot be captured due to distance from the group. If the participants know the researcher is present and is observing them, and if he does not share a good bond with them, they are likely to fake and exhibit socially desirable behavior. The deeper secrets and specialized activities of the particular group are relatively less known than in participant observation, and thus the data obtained can be less rich. What are the various steps in the observational research? First, to prepare oneself and choose a research topic through literature review. Selection of a field and gaining access to it. Familiarizing with the field, social relations with the members. Adopting a social role and getting along. Watching, listening and collecting rich and quality data. Analyzing data to generate and evaluate working hypotheses. Focusing on specific aspects of the setting and using the theoretical sampling. Conducting field interviews to supplement observation with informants. Disengaging and leaving the setting. Completing the analysis and writing a research report. As is shown in a flowchart in the module, the observational research flows some steps which can be broadly and briefly explained as follows. Preparing oneself and choosing the research topic. The field researchers use the skills of careful looking and listening, short-term memory and regular writing. Thus, before entering the field, one must prepare oneself by practicing observing the ordinary details of situations and later writing them down. Reading of literature helps one learn concepts, potential pitfalls, data collection methods, techniques for resolving conflicts, and thus ultimately gain familiarity for emotional preparation to enter the field. Keeping an open mind, getting rid of preconceptions and defocusing. These are two types of defocusing. The first is getting a feel of the overall situation before deciding what to include or exclude. The second type of defocusing is not completely focusing on one's role as a researcher. It is important to extend one's experience much as possible in the field without saying a primary commitment to being a researcher. Another preparation for observational research is self-reflection and self-evaluation, which also affects the process of research. Also, observational researchers are also found to have changed the observer in some way. Either they adapt new values, interests and moral commitments, or give up some. Selecting an observable site and gaining an access to it. A site is wherein an event or activity occurs, a socially defined territory with shifting boundaries. A social group may interact across several physical sites, and then the field site, in order to observe their interaction, would include all these sites. A case is a social relationship or activity. It can extend beyond the boundaries of the site and have links to the other social settings. A researcher selects a site, then identifies cases to examine within it. There are three factors that are crucial while choosing a research site: richness of data, unfamiliarity, and suitability. The site selected should be a rich source of data relating to the phenomena or topic to be studied. It is better if the site presents a web of social relations, diverse activities, and events in an unfamiliar place, because it is easier to see cultural events and social relations in a new site. The suitability must be checked to consider practical issues like the researcher's time, serious conflicts among people in the setting, etc. Physical access to the site may not always be easy, as the researcher is not always readily welcome to enter in places like private firms, clubs, a person's home, legal and political offices, prisons, hospitals, etc. Thus, prior permission for conduction of research must be made a point to remember. Familiarizing with the field relations with the members. Knowing the field site intricately and the members of the setting just enough, depending upon whether the observation is a participant or a non-participant observation, is an important part of the research process. Adopting a social role and getting along. Field rights can be arranged on a continuum by the degree of detachment or involvement the researcher has with the members. At one extreme of the continuum is a detached outsider. At the other extreme is an intimately involved insider. The decision of the role to adopt within this range can be seen to be done, and then actively getting into the field role sets the researcher on the path of research. Watching, listening, and collecting rich and quality data. A good field researcher uses all his or her senses, noticing whatever is seen, heard, smelled, tasted, and touched in a very keen manner. The researcher thus becomes the instrument that absorbs the information. He or she observes the physical setting, the surroundings, the dressing of the people, what they do, how they sit, the context of observation, and almost everything one can think of. It is better to err by including everything than to ignore potentially significant details. Listening helps the researcher to capture the details like the language, phrases, accents, incorrect grammar, etc. Used and argot used by any two individuals, if any. The argot is a specialized language people use of a subculture while giving clues about how they view the world. Watching, listening, the third step now moves on to recording the data. The information may be recorded in a variety of ways, depending upon whether the observation is structured or unstructured. Some of the data collection methods are taking notes, which may be jotted, or analytical memos, maps and diagrams, machine recordings including audio, videotapes, etc. This is the most important part of the observational research paradigm. Analyze data to generate and evaluate working hypotheses. While the data collection is still in process, the existing data is analyzed to recognize any important themes that emerge, and if the research must go in the direction of collecting evidence for these themes. Thus, improvements and changes might be made in the previously stated research question and hypothesis, or they might be completely replaced by new ones. The focus on specific aspects of setting and use theoretical sampling. After getting an overall picture of the field, the researcher now focuses on few specific problems or issues. This happens by focusing the attention on specific questions and themes while the data collection in the field. Observational research generally uses field theoretical sampling, which is guided by developing a theory. Researchers in this kind of sample time by observing a setting at different times. For example, sample situations, types of events, locations, types of people or contexts of interest in order to achieve the focus further and thus narrow down the scope of the study. Conducting field interviews to supplement observation with informants. When observation is being used as an overall research design, then the interview that takes place is not so deep, but is just clarifications for certain recordings of behavior. However, if the research design is a combination of both observation and interview, the interview is usually a deep one. Seeking clarification is important to assert the accuracy of the recordings for analysis that assists the researcher's reflectivity. Disengage and leave the setting. Since the researcher might be in the field for long, and depending on the engagement he or she shows in the field, it might be emotionally painful for both the researcher and the community member to disengage from the setting, more so when the researcher is greatly involved. Leaving might affect in many ways. However, the process of research cannot move on without the process of disengagement with the field to occur. Complete the analysis and write the research report. The analysis is completed through quantifying context analysis, discourse analysis, or any appropriate method, and the results are interpreted and discussed. All the findings, along with the methodology adopted, are presented in a research report for the scientific and general community for sharing knowledge, critique, and evaluation. Thus, these are the steps that observational research observes. Let us look at the data recording in observation research. What to observe? Participant observation has to be selective. It cannot create an all-embracing picture. On the contrary, some objects are brought into limelight and the others are left in the background. Firstly, sensitivity towards certain concepts, then others affects what to observe question. Then, theory provides indications of what to observe. The possible subjects of observation may be classified into the following areas: physical setting, social setting, formal interactions, informal interactions, interpretations of the social actors. However, this classification of what to observe is only one of the possible ways of classification. However, in particular, observation, an initial preliminary descriptive phase, is involved, in which the external visible features of the study environment are outlined, followed by a phase of genuine interaction with the protagonists. Physical setting, the description and scrutiny of the structural layout of the areas in which the behavior takes place, and later to give a detailed account of this in the research repost, is an important phenomena to be observed. This is not only done to communicate the observational experience more clearly, but also because the physical characteristics almost always reflect social characteristics as well as conditioning social behavior. The researcher, however, should not evaluate the novelist, but should provide descriptions rather than evaluations or impressions. Thus, rather referring to a neighborhood as depressing or socially deprived, he should describe the state of the roads, the shops, the typical housing, etc. If the study is conducted in a firm, information should be provided about the location of offices, the position of common areas like canteens, etc. Social settings. The human element while the study of phenomena is carried out is also to be described the same way as the physical environment. This would involve describing the people seen in the streets at various times of day and night, how they dress, the purpose of their movement like going to shopping, etc., their family income, expenditure, and so on. When the study focuses on social change, the history becomes important, and thus any remnants of any individual, their photographs, etc., becomes worthy of observation. Formal interactions. By formal interactions, we mean those interactions where the roles are pre-established and relationships are played, mostly between individuals and institutions and organizations. In this regard, the researcher might observe how communications take place among various hierarchical levels in firms or the dynamics of a group meeting. The researcher would then describe the physical and social settings and then describe the actions and the interactions and the decisions made in the meetings of the group of people and so on. Informal interactions. The informal interactions in most cases constitute the core of the participant observation. They are difficult to study, moreover, since their observation involves scrutinizing a multiple different situations. It is impossible to provide rules or guidelines. Firstly, the observer can begin with the physical interactions. In every social situation, it is defined by the place, the actors, and the actions. Then, repeated observations give rise to a pattern in repeated individual acts, and then these are described. The participant observer needs to be aware of all these scraps of everyday life. If he wishes to analyze them, he must learn to observe and isolate them. However, the scope of the study will gradually focus more closely on specific objects and social processes and thus become narrower. Social actors' interpretations. In the interpretive paradigm, the individual observed is not merely a passive object of research, but becomes an active protagonist. His interpretation of reality is therefore a constituent part, not simply an accessory of scientific knowledge. In this perspective, his verbal communication with the observer becomes a preferential channel of communication. How to observe? The how of observation always includes the collection of data, or in other words, the recording of data. There are many ways of recording observation. The selection of a method of recording depends upon the purpose of observation. Let us first look at narratives. The researcher records a description of the interaction in his or her own words. Usually, he or she makes brief notes while observing the interaction, and soon after the observation makes detailed notes of while observing in a narrative form. Some researchers may interpret the interaction and draw conclusions from it. The biggest intent is to capture, as completely as possible, everything that the participants said and did during the specified period of time. Although researchers once wrote handwritten notes as they observed, the researchers today are most likely to produce written narratives from audio or videotaped recordings, or record a spoken narrative into a tape recorder as they observe the participants' behavior, and it is later transcribed. Narrative records differ in their explicitness and completeness. Sometimes, researchers try to record verbatim virtually everything the participant says or does. More commonly, researchers take field notes that include summary descriptions of the participants' behaviors, but with no attempt to record behavior verbatim. The biggest advantage of this method is that they provide a deeper insight into the interaction. However, the disadvantages are that the observer may be biased and thus the interpretations might also have been biased. An important part of the interaction might get missed as the researcher is more involved in observing. With different observers, the comparability of the researcher's recording narratives would be a problem. They cannot be analyzed directly by quantifying the observations made. Checklists. Narrative records are classified as unstructured in nature. In contrast, there exist structured and systematic methods of collecting or recording observations. A structured observation method is one in which the observer records, times, or rates behavior on the dimensions that have been decided upon in advance. The simplest structured observation technique is a checklist or a tally sheet on which the researcher records attributes of the participants such as age, sex, and race, whether their rights behaviors were observed. In some cases, the observers are interested only in whether a single particular behavior occurred. Although checklists may seem to be an easy and straightforward way of recording behavior, researchers often struggle to develop a clear, explicit, operational definition of target behaviors. Thus, checklists only gets the quantitative aspect of the study and not the qualitative aspect of the study. Observational rating scales. For some purpose, researchers are interested in measuring the quality or intensity of behavior. For example, if a developmental psychologist may want to know not only whether a child cried when teased but how hard he cried, the observer might rate the child's crying on a 3-point scale, with 1 being slight, 2 being moderate, and 3 being extreme. These kinds of rating scales may be subjective decisions and thus the variables need to be operationalized. These kinds of observations do not provide in-depth information about the interaction. Error of central tendency. Unless the observer is extremely confident of her ability to access an interaction, she might tend to avoid the extreme positions on the scale, which is named the error of central tendency. Elevation effect. Some observers prefer certain selections of the scale, just like some teachers are strict markers or not, and this tendency to use one part of the scale is known as the elevation effect. Halo effect. This error enters when the way the observer rates an individual on one aspect of interaction influences the way he or she rates that individual on all other aspects of interaction. Recording can be done using scales or using categories, which is then called categorical rating or recording, and when the observations are videotaped, it is recorded on mechanical devices. Recording on mechanical devices. Observation, especially of these days, is usually recorded on a videotape or a tape recorded and then observed, transcribed, and analyzed. The advantages of taping the interaction is that the observer can see it as many number of times before drawing inferences and can also invite other professionals to view the tape in order to arrive at more reliable and objective conclusions. However, the disadvantage is that some people may feel uncomfortable or may behave differently before a camera. Therefore, the interaction might not show the true reflection. However, the audio tape recording poses lesser threat due to greater chances of confidentiality, and thus they are good options for recording the observations. The same as the above goes with recording done by clicking photographs of significant observations. However, if allowed, videotape is a better option as the flow of interaction is maintained, unlike a snapshot. Now let us talk about the reliability and validity of observation as a research method. Validity in observations. There are questions about two types of validity in observation-based research. In effect, comments about the subjective and idiosyncratic nature of participant observation study are its external validity. How does one know that results of this one are applicable to the other situation? In participant observation, it is feared that researchers' judgment will be affected by their close involvement in the group related to the internal validity of the method. Through sampling, the researchers employ a way of checking on the representativeness of the events that they observe and of cross-checking their interpretations of the meaning of those events. Thus, in addition to external validity, Observation, especially participant observation, must also have rigorous internal validity checks. There are several threats to validity and reliability. Here, for example, the researchers, while recording the present events, might be unaware of the antecedent events. The informants might be unrepresentative or not so rich sources of information. The presence of observer might bring about different behaviors. The researcher might go native, becoming too attached to the group to see it sufficiently dispassionately. To address these issues, some suggestions about triangulation of the data sources and methodologies as a way to increase validity and reliability have been given. Reliability. Practitioners of structured observation have been concurred with a degree of inter-observer consistency. Essentially, this issue entails considering the degree to which two or more observers of the same or similar behavior agree in terms of their coding of the behavior on the observation schedule. That is, the inter-observer consistency. The chief mechanism of assessing this component is a statistic called kappa. A second consideration in relation to reliability is the degree of consistency of the application of the observation schedule over time. This is intra-observer consistency. This is clearly difficult because of the capacity for and often necessity for people to behave in different ways on different occasions and in different contexts. Reliability is more difficult to achieve as it is also affected by observer fatigue, lapses in attention, missing recording certain behavior, over-attachment to the group, halo effect, elevation effect, effect of central tendency error, and so on. However, some studies have been able to show high reliability. There is no doubt that the observers can be trained to use complex coding schedules with considerable reliability. There are a few ethics in observational research. Observational research is a part of field research and has conflicting ethical issues which can be stated as follows. Deception. The issue of deception gets in when usually the research is covert or many assume a false role, name or identity, or may mislead the numbers in some way. Covert research is never preferable and never easier than overt research because there is always the constant fear of getting caught. However, some topics can only be researched through covert research. Confidentiality. A researcher learns intimate knowledge that is given in confidence. He or she has a moral obligation to uphold the confidentiality of the data. This is done by keeping information confidential from others in the field and disguising members' names in the filed notes. The researcher can also use old memos, newspapers, articles, etc. as a source of information instead of reporting the source as the participant. Involvement with deviance. Researchers conduct observation research on people who engage in illegal, immoral, or unethical behavior, face additional dilemmas. They know of this and are also sometimes involved in illegal activity. Giving voice to the unheard. The researchers who conduct a study on those without power are criticized for being biased. This is largely because they give voice to those who are generally unheard in the society. Publishing field reports, the intimate knowledge obtained through observation created a dilemma between the right of privacy and the right to know. One cannot publicize the secrets of the participants, violate their privacy, or harm their reputations. Yet this is not possible as whatever learned will remain hidden and it becomes difficult for others to believe the report if the critical details are not discussed and omitted. Some researchers suggest asking members to look at the report and verify its accuracy and portrayal of the person in print. However, if not possible, the researchers must keep in mind the members' privacy. Let us look at some of the advantages and limitations of the observational research. The observational research, with its flexible and emergent research design, is effective for exploring topics about which little is known. It is thus used for exploratory research. The rich descriptions in the recordings result in a deep understanding of the phenomena. It is particularly powerful when combined with other methods such as interviews. It is well suited to both the discovery of new information and validation of existing knowledge. It has good ecological validity as it follows the concepts of naturalism. This method can not only tell us what is going on, but also who is involved, when and where things happen, and may show a high correlation, suggesting why things happen as they do in a particular setting. It can also prove accounts of non-verbal data. When conducted in contrived settings, replication is also possible. The chronology of events can also be observed and continuities over time can be looked at. The use of modern technological equipment such as video recorders or tape recorders allow more permanent records to be made, which can be independently analyzed and reanalyzed in detail, ensuring reliability. Thus, observational methods can be seen to be very important parts of the research methodology of behavioral sciences. What are the limitations of observational research? Only the overt behavior of a person can be observed, but no clue about the internal cognitive processes and emotions can be drawn. However, inferences can be made. Infrequently occurring acts are difficult to capture, even with prolonged time spent in the field. Observation requires a substantial amount of time and other resources and is usually tied to one specific setting, raising questions to transferability of findings to other settings. As the method is very dependent on the ability of the observer, it is subjected to observer bias, which researchers can channel both in their observation and interpretation of data through what they know. There may be low external validity of the findings. A researcher, if not well trained, may produce over impressionistic, carelessly produced, or just idiosyncratic data. The researcher might record irrelevant data if the why of the problem or research is not clear. If sampling has been done and the who to research or observe is not clear, the sample chosen may be inappropriate. The presence of the researcher may make the participants conscious and alert, and they may not be eliciting their original behavior. In participant observation, the observer and the participants influence one another. Over-attachment may lead to misinterpretation of data recorded and also in the process of recording. Some researchers might unconsciously be selective because of their own personalities and thus miss out on the otherwise significant data. Despite the above limitations, observation is an indispensable part of behavioral research. As with awareness of oneself and pitfalls of the method, the above limitations may be overcome. So, the summary for the module is, the module began with the different ways in which the researcher can be involved in the research situation or the fieldwork, the participant and the non-participant observational styles. Then the various methods of how to conduct observational research, the various tools of recording the observations have been explored, the different things which needed to be taken in to consider to choose as the participant in the observational research, what criteria to consider before and during the selection have been given. Finally, the reliability and validity of observation as a research tool method have been established, and the ethical principles inherent in the observational research have also been presented. The conclusion of the discussion is done by a critical evaluation of the method of research in order to make the reader aware of all the possible advantages and the loopholes of the research method. Because of this awareness, we may be able to come to the right interpretation of results without any bias. This slide talks about the last approach to observational research method. The approach of participant observation serves good when the research question involves understanding a behavior within the context of the people being observed. Participant observation is an intense social interaction between observer and participant in the milieu of the latter, during which time data in the form of field notes are unobtrusively and systematically collected. Schwartz and Schwartz define participant observation as a process in which the observer's presence in a social situation is maintained for the purpose of scientific investigation. Advantages of participant observation. More intensive participation has the advantage of affording the observer a great exposure to both the routine and the unusual activities of the group studied. The assumption is that more intensive the participation, the richer the data. They are extremely useful in exploratory research and those in which hypotheses can be generated. This can be possible only in the undisguised manner, either completely or partially, which thus has lesser ethical impediments. Disadvantages of participant observation. They involve conscious, deliberate, non-original exhibition of behavior due to the undisguised nature of the research and presence of researcher. The presence of the researcher might materially influence the group behavior, which thus leads to lower reliability of the observations. Due to experience of similar feelings, misinterpretation is possible. Non-participant observation can be explained as a situation wherein the researcher is not the part of the group he is studying and stays aloof from the group, as in being a complete observer or a peripheral member as explained above. The advantages of non-participant observation are: more objective form of observation is possible, leaving no scope for misinterpretation due to identification or attachment. It is more easier for both the researcher and the participants to be detached from one another. A low emotional bonding is seen. The observations are more reliable and valid due to the above features. The disadvantages of non-participant observation are: the slighter, subtle, in-depth intricacies cannot be captured due to distance from the group. If the participants know the researcher is present and is observing them, if he does not share a good bond with them, they are likely to fake and exhibit socially desirable behavior. The deeper secrets and the specialized activities of the particular group are relatively less known than in participant observation, and thus the data obtained can be less rich. The steps in observation research are: 1. Preparing oneself and choosing the research topic. 2. Selecting a observable site and gaining access to it. Third, familiarizing with the field, relations with the members. Fourth, adopting a social role and getting along. Fifth, watching, listening, and collecting rich and quality data. Sixth, analyze data to generate and evaluate working hypotheses. Seventh, focus on specific aspects of the setting and use theoretical sampling. Eighth, conducting field interviews to supplement observation with informants. Ninth, disengage and leave the setting. 10th, complete the analysis and write the research report. We now discuss the various components to be systematically observed by the researcher in order to not miss out on the important information which might give an important understanding of the behavior being observed. They are categorized under the what to observe question, which includes the description of the physical setting, the social interactions, and description of the nature of the setting, the formal and informal interactions that take place with respect to the participant, and the various interpretations of the behavior elicited. The how of observation can be answered by how the researcher desires to observe the situation systematically. Usually, qualitative researchers use narratives, field notes, diaries, and memoirs for analysis, while quantitatively oriented researchers choose checklists, rating scales, and mechanical devices such as tape recorders, video cameras for recording and further analysis of details. We now talk about the two important pillars of instruments of research named reliability and validity. The reliability of the instrument is the consistency of scores or recording across situations, researchers, and time. The validity of an instrument is of several types, but the basic concept is whether the instrument measures what it is supposed to measure. The validity of observational evidence checked with two kinds of mechanisms: external validity and internal validity. The threat to external validity is the non-verifiability of the information because of the subjective involvement of the researcher in the situation. The internal validity is, of course, limited because of the subjectivity and the reciprocal influence of the researcher on the setting and vice versa. Thus, researcher can thus take certain checks into consideration to make the inquiry more valid. These involve taking care of being aware of the biases, being attentive to the context, not missing information, objective recording, and the like. The measure of reliability is possible with inter-observer reliability and intra-observer reliability. This measure is possible with the use of structured and objective interview schedules. This, however, does not guarantee complete reliability as people behave differently in different situations. The chief component in measuring the consistency is the statistics known as kappa. Ethics. The moral guidelines of research are aimed at protecting the interests of everyone who are a part of the research endeavor. In observational research, the ethical issues of deception, confidentiality, giving voice to the unheard, involvement with deviants, publishing reports, and the like are of utmost importance as they govern the whole process of research and give a voice to the seldom heard rights of the participants and researchers. These thus help in making important decisions, which makes research a utilitarian endeavor, not transgressing the rights and dignity of any individual.